we'd love to have you at more of our programs. And if you are new to these, please find one of the brochures at the end. We have a number of brochures. We have 2 programs left after Esther today. On March 11th, we host Cuban-American theologian and historian Justo Gonzalez. And on April the 15th, we host mezzo-soprano Andrea Baker, who has a program called Sing, Sister Sing, about the history of African-American women's voice. And we hope to see you at both of those. I'm going to turn over the introduction to Tyler Counts, one of my student assistants, but I also want to give you 2 quick announcements. At 7 o'clock tonight, Esther will speak again at Central Presbyterian Church. More immediately, though, after this talk, we're going to move her over to the Tadlock House, which is about a 3-minute walk from here. We'll have coffee and donuts, and if you want the chance to sit down and talk to her for a while more individually, you're very welcome to join us for that. Also at lunch, we'll go to the cafeteria after that about 11:15. And we'll be in the Tipton room at the back of the cafeteria. Any of you are welcome to come join us, students, community. We'd love to see you there. So also, one other quick thing that I'm forgetting. This is a program that we're hosting through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And along with Esther, who is a member of the Survivors Speakers Bureau, we have Carrie Bannister with us. Carrie works for the museum, particularly with Survivors Affairs. So if you want to talk a bit about the museum, find Carrie at the end as well. Thank you, and here's Tyler Counts.
Hello. Today I have the privilege of introducing Mrs. Esther Starobin, but I'm going to leave the majority of her story to tell. Mrs. Starobin is currently a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She has also served as an educator who shaped the minds of our country's young children. Teachers have the ability to inspire their students, and Mrs. Starobin found her own inspiration to teach when she was taken under the wing of a teacher who shared her Jewish faith. Mrs. Starobin would then go on to inspire her own generation of American children in the classroom. When she worked as an educator, she served in one of the most diverse school districts in the country. During that time, she placed great value on diversity and multiculturalism. Being able to focus on the different backgrounds of students and all individuals in general is a vital part in being a successful educator and citizen. Through these actions, educators such as Mrs. Starobin are able to influence the minds of children and future teachers in a positive manner. When individuals come together and acknowledge the diversity that exists in the world, plagues such as hatred and racism can be combated to a point where there is no longer a place for such darkness. Please welcome Mrs. Esther Starobin.
Thank you for that introduction. What a pleasure to be here and see all of you. I thank you for inviting me. Okay. The slide you missed was talking about the kind of survivors, that there are many different kinds of survivors. And I am a survivor who was a refugee. Before we begin, you need to know that. I was born in Adelsheim, which is a tiny place in Baden in Germany. I was the 5th child of my family. My father's family had been in that area for over 200 years. My father served in the First World War, and he lost a leg. So even though he was trained to be a baker, he couldn't be a baker, because you can't really stand and bake on one leg too often, too well. He sold grain to farmers. That was what he did. And he was born in a small place called Korb, which isn't far from Adelsheim. And he was actually born in that house. And then he got married in 1924. And when the first child was born, they moved to Adelsheim because most of the Jews in Korb had left and there weren't enough people there for a service. So they moved to Adelsheim, where there were 10 Jewish families. I have been back to this house in Korb. You can't live in it anymore because the ceilings are so low, because people used to be shorter and that. Anyhow, I was born in 1937, in April. My father had been taken to court in February. A farmer said he had sold him a cow that was bad. Probably not true. But having gotten the court case, it was really interesting. The judge never called my father by his proper name, Adolf Rosenfeld. He called him Jew Rosenfeld. It was part of the time when businesses were being taken away from Jewish owners. So there I was, the fifth child. I don't think they would, well, I don't know if they were happy because I don't remember my parents. In the meantime, my sisters were not living at home anymore because Jewish children were not allowed to go to the public school. They had been sent first to Hebron, a small place to go to school, living with my mother's sisters, and then they went to Aachen to live with other sisters. So in this picture, you see all five. I'm the cute one on the lap. So my brother, my three older sisters, my father, and my mother. I think take particular notice to see they were not thin people. So this was me, taken at the same time as that family picture. And what I think is interesting, my foster mother saved that little dog for me. You know how stuffed animals are nice and soft now? That animal was filled with straw. It's not soft, it's hard and really different than stuffed animals nowadays, but I loved that. So my sisters, as I said, were living in Aachen with my aunts. One of my aunts owned a nightclub, which just amazes me. I can't think of people owning nightclubs. And my other aunt was a seamstress. And my one sister told me that sometimes at night there would be people in the house and they were gone in the morning. So clearly my aunts were helping people escape from Germany. So on Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when police and other people went from town to town, breaking the glass, breaking businesses, going into synagogues and taking out the scrolls and burning them and making old men do all kinds of awful things. That was in November of 1938. My sisters walked off to school the next morning, because it wasn't like today where you know the news the minute it happens, and they saw the synagogue burning and they were told to go home, which of course they did. So after Kristallnacht in England, Jewish community, Christian community went to the Parliament, which is like our Congress, and asked if they could rescue children, bring them to England to save them. And the Parliament agreed. They said children could go to England, they had to be unaccompanied, and there was a £50 fee because they didn't want the children to stay and take jobs away from English people when they grew up. And they didn't think the war would last too long, so they'd be able to go home. So in March of 1939, my three sisters went to England on the kinder transport. Have no idea how it was arranged because my aunts were killed in the Holocaust. But we had an aunt, this is my Aunt Hannah, who had gone to England earlier. This picture wasn't taken in 1939, it was taken much later. But she worked as a domestic because she had gone to England earlier, and the only job that was available to her was to be a domestic, a maid. And she found homes for my three sisters. My oldest sister, Bertle, had foster parents who had a place in Scotland, and they went up to Scotland with her. And once she was 16, she went back to live with my aunt in London. And one day the police came to the door, they knocked on the door, and they asked her if she knew somebody with a name she had no idea who it was. And it turned out her foster father was a spy for the Germans. When they had been in Scotland, he'd been keeping track of what was going on and sending the information back to Germany. What a good cover to have a Jewish kid and be a spy. My second sister, Edie, lived in London, but when the war started, the kids in London were sent out of London to protect them. And she went to live with someone, a Jewish family, and she always said they treated her like a slave. But as my aunt said, They probably didn't, but you were 14, you thought you were being treated like a slave. And my younger sister lived with a doctor in London, and again, she was sent out of London. She first lived with another family, and then she lived in a hostel, which is a group home for children. And she always said she was sent away because she didn't do the Hebrew lessons that were sent to her. Sure, that isn't why she was sent, but I don't really know. So they were in England. Then in June of 1939, my parents sent me. I was 2 years old and 2 months. Have no idea who took care of me on the trip, because clearly I couldn't take care of myself. And when I got to England, the Quakers, that are a Christian sect, found a home for me. My foster father was working in a shoe factory owned by a Jewish man. And this man put a sign up on the bulletin board, "Is anybody willing to take any of these children?" So I came off the bulletin board. And my foster family had one son who's 7 years older than I am. They were very fundamentalist Christians. They belonged to something called the Chapel Movement. They didn't dance, they didn't drink, they didn't wear makeup, they didn't go to movies. However, as an adult, I think they just didn't have the money for some of that kind of thing. So when I first got there, I had scarlet fever, and I was in isolation. But Alan, my foster brother, played with me through the window. And my foster mother, who I called Auntie Dot, told me I was scared of loud noises. And I was scared of my foster father, who was the gentlest man, never raised his voice. But I think coming from Germany, I had heard loud men, the soldiers and the police, and that was probably why I was scared. So I lived in Norwich for 8 years. We were in the country. If we needed to get in the city or go any place, we rode bicycles. We didn't have cars and things, didn't have a telephone. It was very rural. We were never hungry. They had a garden, and I remember we had chickens. And I had a pet chicken that I called Buttercup. Now, we got rid of the chickens, and I sort of remember it was because there were rats. Alan said that isn't why we got rid of them, but he didn't tell me why we got rid of them. So once the war was over, my sisters came to visit. They couldn't really travel around much during the war. One, because they weren't allowed, and two, because they didn't have the money. So, as I said, I was very happy there. I loved school. The chapel that they belonged to had a lot of community affairs. You know, nowadays the big thing in churches and synagogues is community. Well, they had community then. They had lots of activities. I was very happy there. Did I know I was Jewish? Probably. Mr. Ramsey, who actually owned that chapel, tried to teach me Hebrew, but I'm really bad at languages. I didn't really learn any. And once we went to London to my Aunt Hannah to a Seder, but I didn't know what was going on. So I was very oblivious. I didn't ask questions. And in 1947, my sister Bertle, who was kind of responsible for us, had the police come to the door of the Harrisons, because they didn't have a phone, and she said, "Oh, you've got to take Esther to London tomorrow, because we're going to the United States." And, oh, I skipped this whole thing. Oh, sorry, I'm going back. This letter was from the woman, the Quaker lady who was bringing me to Norwich, and it was saying what time I was going to arrive. This was June 26th, and I was going to arrive on June 28th, which was a Friday. I think I looked it up yesterday, that's what it was. And would they be able to meet me? And it also said that I came from a very rich family in Berlin, which was totally untrue, but that they would find an address so they could write to my mother. So this was the tag I wore. All the Jewish girls were given the name Sarah, and the boys Israel. It was another way of identifying and separating the Jews from the rest of the population. This is my dog, my little heavy dog. And my shoes. My foster father was very good at fixing shoes. I wore these boots for a long time, and luckily my foster mother saved them for me, so I have them. But the Harrisons did write to my mother, and this is a letter from my mother, and she's saying that I was sweet, I liked to play with children, I would get over being homesick and all that, and I would get used to them. And it's very special to me that I have this letter. Luckily, my foster mother saved things, so I have some things like this. So this is my foster family, my foster brother. Clearly not when I first got there, because I'm about 6 or 7, 8 there. And this was in their yard. And this dress my aunt made, and then you can see this is later. I'm wearing the dress, and Alan is there in his school uniform. And two of my sisters are there, so you can see they came to visit. And another picture in the yard. Okay, what I didn't know before going to London in 1947, Auntie Dot had written to my uncle in Washington, D.C. and said, could I stay there in Norwich? And my uncle had written back and said, no, we needed to keep the family together. Which is kind of what my mother had told my older sister, that we should all be together in one place. So while all this has been going on, in 1940, my parents and my brother were still in Adelsheim. And in 1940, my brother had been sent away to go to school, and he was home for a Jewish holiday of Sukkot. And all the Jews in Baden, which is like a state, were deported to France. They went to a camp called Gurs, and then the people with children were sent to Rivesaltes. So in France, there was an organization called OSE, and I can't remember what the French name for it is. They took the children out of the camps, and they took them to a home, they fed them, and they taught them to read and, to go to school. And in 1941, 1,000 children were allowed into the United States through this group, and my brother came here then. In the meantime, in 1942, my parents were sent to Auschwitz, and they were on August 14th, 1942, and they were murdered upon their arrival. So I'm not allowed to stay in England, which I'd have been happy to do. But this was a picture taken before November. We had gone to London, and this is a lovely picture of a beefeater. I got it from my foster mother. Just recently, I turned it over. Don't know why I never did before. Who knows? Apparently, we were in London because I was supposed to leave then, but I didn't know it. I don't think kids were told everything back then. It was sort of a lot of surprises in life. So this was my travel document, and we came to the United States. We sailed on the Queen Mary, which wasn't fancy back then. It had been a troop ship and been converted to a troop ship, and it wasn't back to being really luxurious. There was a strike the day we left because somebody from the royal family was on that sailing, and it was a good time to have a strike. But luckily, my sister had a boyfriend who was a butcher. We had a salami. My aunt had sent a loaf of bread, so we were fine, and they gave kids milk. But it wasn't many days before we left. I was terribly seasick, and what I found out much later, my sister didn't want to leave either. But we got here. My middle sister, Ruth, had gone the week before, because that's when they found a place for her. We got to New York, and we were met by 2 uncles, one who had lived in Adelsheim with us, and one who'd married into the family. I had no idea who they were. Bertel remembered the one uncle, Uncle Sally, who was the one who had signed the letter. And we came to Washington, and we lived with an aunt and uncle here. In the meantime, my brother, who was here, was living with a different aunt and uncle. Well, living with my aunt and uncle was not a good experience. I had lived in the country with these sweet, soft-spoken people. Not that they didn't have ways of controlling us kids, they did. But my uncle yelled, he threw furniture, my aunt was mentally ill in the times before there were drugs for people. In this house, which was a big house on the main street in Washington, there was my aunt, my uncle, my aunt's mother, 2 cousins, another refugee family, my sisters and I. It was a big, busy household, so different. I went to a school that was very different than the school I'd been to. A family, I didn't really know my sisters. I mean, they'd visited, but I hadn't really lived with them. And a new religion. It was a very different place. And what's really interesting, there's a movie about the Kindertransport called Into the Arms of Strangers. And some of the people in there talk about how awful it was going to England, that the families didn't love them right away, and they had chores. They had to help around the house, and they weren't used to that. To me, going to England was fine. It was coming to America that wasn't fine. So we lived with my aunt and uncle. I went to elementary school, and I have a lazy eye. I had never had a patch. I had glasses. I was 10 years old. I was as different as could be from every other kid, and I had to wear a patch on my eye, so I couldn't see. But of course, as soon as I left the house, I took the patch off, like any self-respecting kid would do. And it was a big shock to me when I found out at school they knew I was supposed to be wearing it. But it doesn't really help when you're 10 years old. So it was, school then was not a good thing. In England, the schools then were far advanced than the schools here, so I didn't really learn a lot of new things. And the teacher made fun of me because some English words are different than American English words, and that's all I remember about it. That wasn't good. But then I went to junior high, and I had this lovely teacher that you mentioned, who, before mentoring was developed, took us under her wing. We ate lunch with her at least once a week and all that. So there were 3 Jewish kids, and we all got to eat with Miss Balsam. Now, my sister Bertle didn't like one of these kids. She thought she was too advanced for her age and not a good influence, but that's not true. And that, so once my second sister, who'd been in the Army, came to the United States, and both my sisters had jobs, they got an apartment, and luckily they took me with them, because otherwise I would have had to stay with my aunt and uncle. So my brother was living in a different place. He called my aunt and uncle Mom and Dad, which my sister didn't like, and I didn't remember him at all. I really didn't. I mean, I took to him, he was like Alan. So sometimes when my sisters were dating teachers at the schools I was going to, it was really odd. But back then in the DC area, there were lots of families that were not just mom and dad and kids. It was a pretty common experience at that time for there to be other people living in the family. And that we moved a lot. I went to 2 junior highs and 2 high schools. So since I had been skipped when I came to this country, I graduated from college just after I was 16. And being a totally unaware person, never occurred to me I couldn't go to college. You know, and my sister didn't say you couldn't go to college. And one of my sisters was married by then and living at the University of Illinois with her husband. So I went to the University of Illinois and lived with my sister and brother-in-law. My brother-in-law became my guardian. I hadn't had a guardian forever. He every once in a while tried to tell me what to do, which wasn't nice. But I think now when I look back on it, it was a school where most kids lived on campus and I didn't. And sometimes I read in the paper when they talk about first generations going to college and the help they need, I realize I didn't know a lot of those things that they think people need to know. My sister, who I was living with, had gone to college, but I think she was enough older that she knew some of this and she lived on campus. So I went to the University of Illinois. I got a teaching degree. In one of my classes, I found out I could get my citizenship when I was 18 instead of 21, and I got a teaching job. I loved teaching. I was pretty good at teaching, actually. And I came back, when I first came back, I lived with my older sister. And then I had a blind date, and I met my husband, and we got married. So I had 2 children. I took off 9 years to take care of the kids, went back to teaching, and then I retired in, that's my uncle that I lived with, and my sister Edie, and then this is me in junior high, and high school and college. So I progressed, the pictures got better. That's because I had a boyfriend who liked to take pictures. Okay. So just after I graduated from high school and was in my first year, this is my sister's, it was actually my sister Edie's wedding. So we all looked like pretty normal Americans, didn't we? And unfortunately, the marriage didn't last, but that was us. So in the 1980s, when there started to be a lot of information about the Holocaust on television, my sister Bertel said, "Oh, I have some letters from our mother when she was in Gers and Rivesaltes." And my husband had them translated, and that's basically all I know about my mother. My father wrote maybe 3 lines underneath. And my mother told Bertel, when we were still in England, living in different places, to make sure we thanked the people who were taking care of us, washed behind our ears, studied hard, were good, all the things mothers say. There was no way my sister could do that. First of all, she was 15, 16. We were all in different places. It was before the age of telephones everywhere. But she really wanted us to survive. She also thought that they were going to be able to join us. And she had such faith that God would look after us and people would be willing to take care of us, that family would take care of us, which they did. So in this letter, you can see at the top, one part of it, she asked Bertel to save her clothes because she'd gotten so small she could wear it. And if you remember from the picture, she wasn't exactly a petite person in there. And then she mentions about Herman being in a home, and we didn't know which home. We had no idea. So to me, it's really important to have these letters. And in fact, my grandson, who was taking a Holocaust course in college and had to write a paper, he went through, and there's 5 letters. I mean, it isn't like there were lots of letters, and showed how my mother was trying to parent us even though she was in a camp far away from us. She always believed in God, even in the last letter where she clearly knew they were not going to survive. She had such faith. So, in the late 1980s, by then I was retired. I was volunteering at the Holocaust Museum, and I needed to know that I didn't come from a black hole. Where did I come from? And my older sister Bertel and her husband were going to go with me to Adelsheim, but my brother-in-law had a heart attack, so they couldn't go. But Fred and I went, and we got to Adelsheim around lunchtime. There wasn't a soul around. It was so creepy. It was like the town was dead. But they were all at lunch. And we finally found the town hall, and no one spoke English. And I don't speak German. I took it in high school and college and still don't speak it. But they told us to come back the next day because the deputy mayor's wife spoke English, and they would take us on a tour. So they said, you can go out of here and find a hotel to stay at. And I said, nope, you're not sending me away again. And we stayed in a guest house. I had such nightmares that night. I dreamt the Nazis were coming upstairs to get me. Had no idea what we ate because the menu was in German and we just picked something to eat. So the next day, we met Mr. Wedderhahn, who was an older man who knew my parents. And the deputy mayor's wife who translated, and they did show us things. They showed us the house from the outside where my parents had lived. Well, I'd lived there too. And my sister had told me a couple of places to see. There was a creek, and my second sister told me about dropping. They used to take the challah to be baked in the community oven, and she told me about dropping the dough in the creek. So I saw the creek, and we saw the cemetery, and the next town there was a little synagogue. So we did see all that. Did it feel like home? No, I felt like a tourist seeing touristy things. But I was glad that I went. And then my sister Bertel and her husband did go after that, and they met a different man, Reinhard Lochman, who had taken over from Mr. Wedderhahn because Mr. Wedderhahn got too old to be doing this. And there were 10 Jewish families, and when anybody wrote back to Adelsheim to find out what happened and things about their family, Reinhard and his after-school group, because he taught school, would look it up and send it back. So much of what I know comes from Reinhard. And in 2000, he decided to have a commemoration of the deportation of the Jews from Adelsheim. And my sister and I looked at each other and we said, they need Jews there. So we went, and one of my brother's kids went. First we went to a place called Rexingen, which my mother came from. And going back at some point, my sister Bertel was totally illiterate about computers, and she said to me one day, see if you can find anybody from Rexingen, which I did, and this young man answered, and he said, I'm in Washington, D.C., going to school. And my sister Bertel said, I'm going to meet him. And I'm a cautious person. I said, you can't go meet a strange person by yourselves. Her husband went with, and we became friends with this Tim. And he said, his parents would love us to stay with them in Rexingen. So we went to Rexingen, and they showed us there's a cemetery there that has all the Jewish community that had been built there. And there's a book that's been written about the cemetery. It lists all the Jewish families and when they died and who their relatives, so I could find some information about people in my family. Of course, there's another book written about the Crusaders who were buried there too. It's a big cemetery. And then we went to Adelsheim. And the first day we got there, Bertel translated for me. And when she'd been in first grade, while she could still go to public school, somebody in their class had died. So she's sitting, just like when you go to a reunion from school, they're talking about why this person died. But while we were there, somebody came up and said his father used to leave our parents food after dark, and that his mother was really upset about it. And I said to Bertel, do you think it's true? Because a lot of people say they did things after the fact. And she said there had been other letters from my mother, and she had talked about it, and somebody else came up and told us a similar story. But for the commemoration, which was in the next little town, there were about 100 people there. Reinhard had made exhibits about each of the 5 families that he was in contact with. They were all photocopied. It isn't like here where you get fancy pictures and that. And there were neo-Nazis outside, and there were security outside. It was all in German. Did I understand any of it? No, but I've had it translated. So this is the cover of it and exactly what happened. Even though I didn't understand it, it was a very moving kind of ceremony. Among other things, he read one of my mother's letters there. Bertel was supposed to make a speech, but she got through the first line and started crying, so Reinhard read it for her. But one of the things he found for us while he was there was this list of items that had been taken from our family house. It's pages and pages. It even included rags. So you can see here how detailed they were in what the stuff was sold and the money sent to Germany. Bertel said there was a very fancy doll in the living room that they weren't allowed to play with. That's not on this list. Somebody had taken that already. And the mother of a friend of mine did a loose translation of this for me. And she said there was no furniture on it, and I hadn't noticed that. But this, I mean, it's an amazing list. It goes on and on and on. So the other thing that happened while we were there, Reinhard had arranged for us to go inside the house where we lived. Well, it had been redone. It was beautiful. But up in the attic, there was a son who was the same age as one of my grandsons, had exactly the same toys. The difference were the toys were very neatly put away and organized. My grandsons never were. But I just, you know, it's just amazing. The world is so small. I mean, the same toys, the same kinds of things. And what I didn't know, apparently, when my parents lived with them, they had the bottom floor, but the middle floor, there were two ladies living there. They also had goats in the backyard because Bertel said they had to drink goat milk, which she thought was awful. So in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a new exhibit, What the Americans Knew. And when they were doing research for this, they found this picture. And the little boy with his head turned, wearing a tag, is my brother. This was him waiting in 1941 in Lisbon to get on the ship. And there's a list of people, of these kids, who they were and where they were coming from. So I have become friends with a young woman from Vienna who has written a book about somebody else on the Kindertransport, and her person was on this list too. And from her research, we know where my brother was, because you remember in the letter my mother had mentioned he was somewhere else. And my brother's children have been able to find out quite a bit about my brother. Now, my brother would never talk about his experiences. He never, ever would. When I went to Adelsheim and sent a postcard, his wife told me he wouldn't even look at the postcard. So I was with a couple of my nieces recently, and I said, do you think your father would be happy that you know this? And they both said no. He would be very upset that we knew these things had happened to him. Because remember, he came here to America when he was 8. He'd been sent away to school, he'd been in a camp, he'd been taken away again, and then he'd been sent and living with relatives he didn't know. And my aunt had said when he first came, he hid food, he wet the bed. You know, he was clearly a pretty disturbed kid, but what a lot to happen before you're 8 years old. So we're happy to know this. This was taken in 1975, my husband, me. It was the one in the long dress spot mitzvah, and my older daughter, and that. And then this one more picture. This is my extended family. It was 2 years ago on my 80th birthday. We have a few more in the family now. But my sister did this superior job of making us into a very close family. My parents would have 10 grandchildren. They're all friends. Their 2 nephews. The nieces get together every few years and have a little retreat at the beach. The next generation, maybe not quite so close because they don't all live together, but we are a very close family, and I do wonder what's going to happen in the future. Thank you. Can you say something? No?
Thank you again. If you have a minute and want to come speak to Esther here, that'd be great. She'll be happy to talk to you. I think you'll be happy to talk to people.
Yeah.
And then we'll go over to the Tadlock House for coffee and donuts after. Thank you again for being with us this morning, and please join me again in thanking Esther Starobin. Yeah.